we are going to go to our presentation, our feature presentation, which is an update on the priority issues for the NJTPA and the region. Zoe Baldwin is Vice President of the State Programs and New Jersey Director of Regional Plan Association. Ms. Baldwin has over 20 years of experience in public policy at the state and federal levels and leads research, planning, and advocacy activities here in New Jersey. So Zoe, are you ready?
All right. Good afternoon or morning. It's morning.
Morning.
One of those days. Happy Monday. So I'm Zoe Baldwin, Vice President for State Programs at the Regional Plan Association. And I guess a good place to start is a little bit about who we are. We're the nation's oldest metropolitan research planning and advocacy organization. And we work in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. On the map right here is kind of our research area. Obviously, our policy extends statewide. But broadly, we work to improve the region's economic health, environmental resilience, mobility, and quality of life. And so we're 100 years old. And so what we do is we specialize in looking way down the road and then helping cities, agencies, and advocates get there step by step. And so we were founded in 1922, and we've basically spent the past century researching and analyzing the built environment and making recommendations for long-term projects and policies. These are our main research areas: land use, transportation, housing, good governance, and the environment. And again, we work to enact the policies kind of in these and make sure our systems are working. And again, the common thread is systems here. The systems that we live inside of every day and how those systems either support or undermine our well-being. So since 1929, we've released 4 long-range plans to guide the growth and development of the region. These plans have led to the establishment of some of the region's most significant infrastructure, open space, and economic development projects, including the George Washington Bridge, Gateway National Park, and even the Hudson-Bergen Light Rail. We, of course, wanted it to go to Bergen. But the most recent one was released in 2017, and that guides a lot of the work that we do today, which is why I'm so excited to say this is probably familiar to most people in this room, but the Gateway project is finally in construction and advancing, and I can't express how important this is. And I'd like to share. So RPA actually just released a fantastic report outlining the economic promise that the full Gateway program is going to bring to the region. And so what that means is not just the construction, which is a lot of the time when we talk about projects, we're talking about jobs and immediate impacts because of that, but the long-term through 2060 impact of this is going to be about $230 billion in economic activity for the tri-state area and $170 billion nationwide in its first 15 years of operation, so 2045 to 2060. And construction alone is projected to generate about $43 billion of that. And so this is also going to support about 24,000 jobs each year in the region and 46,000 jobs nationally through construction, labor, increased demand for goods and services, and labor market access. And it's going to be great to highlight these benefits like these in addition to the clear commuter benefits, because anyone who has been at the mercy of the Portal Bridge on an ornery day can tell you the cost of this inefficiency is massive. And as we've really been experiencing lately, this is a really fragile system. We had the summer of hell last year. We have a looming strike now, and I feel like we have not in a very long time been reminded of just how critical this system is. And so, the tunnels are over 110 years old. And if one of them goes down, we lose 75% of our peak capacity. And that basically shuts down the region. And then financially, a partial shutdown of the tunnel, even without full collapse, would cost the U.S. economy $16 billion over 4 years. And so a lot of that's like lost productivity, freight delays, increased car traffic from people having to drive, especially because what we're looking at now with this consistent unreliability in our system, and something that I'm very concerned about looking at the looming strike ahead, is actually mode shift. I'm very concerned that we are allowing the system to get to a level of unreliability where people who do have the choice won't choose transit. And so that's something that we really need to think about. We have a slightly different ecosystem here than we do in New York. When you're talking about strap hangers and you're talking about MTA, where you have a very broad spectrum of the populace dependent on transit. Here we have more people that are dependent on it or reliant on it for their commutes, but not for every day. And that really changes ownership and dedication to the system. And so we need to make sure that we have everyone in this room and the people that rely on the system, your constituents, really focused on making sure that the state continues to invest, because this is going to be a problem. And Gateway is more than just one project, and we'll get to that in a second. But for those of you who may still be cynics, I hope none of you are. We ran, I want to say it was 2021, we did a report that looked at 4 different scenarios of varying levels of work from home and return to office. And it showed that under every single one of those scenarios, we need this capacity. So beyond the delays, we are growing and our population is wanting to get to the city by transit. And so this really isn't about restoring service. It's about preparing for the growth that we already have. And so, just common sense, you got to build ahead of need, not after it or not behind it, right? So what are we building? Because again, I want to reference, a lot of people use shorthand, they say the Gateway Tunnel. And the tunnel is a great project. We're very excited. It's very necessary. But the full Gateway program has major supporting projects. Many of them are underway, including the Portal Bridge. But it's all of these bridges, stations, loops, and yards that actually make the whole system more resilient and get us where we need to go. We need that full panoply of projects to get the economic system and capacity benefits, like the one-seat ride for the River Line. But there's some good news for a change. We're actually making some real progress. Historic federal funding is in place for phase 1, and construction has started on both sides of the river on the Hudson Yards components, Portal Bridge, and of course, the tunnel itself. And after more than a decade since the death of ARC, Gateway isn't just a plan, it's actually in motion. And so we although need to remember that we had shovels in the ground last time. And so just assuming that because this thing is going along, that it's going to keep going along, especially in our current climate, I think that it's a little bit of a danger zone. We need to keep our advocacy going, and we need to make sure that we continue to have the supports that are going to advance this project. So I'm going to address the elephant in the room. As good a place as any to get ahead of some of the questions I assume some of you are going to have on Gateway and just broader federal funding issues that folks in this room are probably aware of. And so I actually want to start by flagging something that I think most people don't think of top of mind, but I've been kind of in the weeds on this at the federal and state levels for a couple of decades. And so if you really look at what our trends are doing in terms of the relationship between the federal and the state government, we've actually been seeing a long-term functional shift away from a more federalist-led structure, right? We're leaving the primary burden of the actual policy decisions up to states. And so I would actually argue that, this is very apparent in the last, 100 or so days. But this shift has actually been going on for a really long time. Look at offshore wind development. Everywhere in the world, that was a federally led project, a nationally led project. And here we left it up to states. And that's a really emblematic vision or understanding of kind of functionally where we're going. It hasn't been a stated change. But if you really drill down into what's going on right now, the majority of what the federal government does is they provide some funding, and that even before the Trump administration. Anyone working in procurement knows that there's been a little bit of jockeying for how your project gets prioritized if you have less federal component towards it. And other than that, they offer some financing and incentives for like good decisions, air quotes. As opposed to true national policy initiatives or implementation frameworks, right? So what that means is in context of IIJA, everyone loved reading off these big top line federal numbers and then, kind of relating it to the New Deal, but the two couldn't kind of be different or more different, right? So for transportation, IIJA kind of just plussed up our existing capital programs and, through the formula funds. And so it basically accelerated all of your existing programs, for better or for worse. On the local level, I'm sure a lot of you realize we got a lot of paving because there's no design in paving. You can kind of roll it out quickly and your constituents feel it. But this is really, really different than like kind of the broad policy-focused implementation program with a stated vision like we saw in the 1930s. And I'm not minimizing the importance of IHAA. Competitive funding is really, really important, but it is born of a structure that favors local control and generally produces less predictable results because it's kind of unevenly implemented. So crashes, traffic pollution, obviously don't observe political boundaries, but the policies that govern them do, and those are increasingly being made at home. And land use follows into that immediately. It's that same format, swapping out municipalities and counties for states as like the local entity. And I use that framing just to highlight the importance of the work in everyone's in this room and the diligence, right? Because the key detail is that even under a more supportive administration, there's no superhero swooping in. This is not a 4-year problem. This onus of action has for a long time been shifting to the states and therefore on the ecosystem that's represented in this room, the advocates and practitioners that inform all of these decisions. And so I came across this recently while writing comments for a different event, but I started working in infrastructure policy about 25 years ago, and transportation was kind of a bipartisan issue at the time. And New Jersey was a national leader in planning and smart growth and, believe it or not, project delivery. People used to compare MTA and say, man, I wish they could build like NJ Transit does. And I didn't realize it at the time, but we were rapidly expanding our rail system. And I just want to pause to emphasize this because, this is kind of impressive. I had no idea what an outlier I started my career in terms of like an era. But, you had the Hudson Bergen Light Rail, started in 1996, kind of went through 2011. But that's now a core spine for the region. We got increased access to one-seat rides. We had broader system expansions in light rail. Secaucus Junction was a game changer for the system. And although it doesn't run all the time, and Jim Kirkos really is on point with really advocating for it too, Meadowlands is an important line, and it's going to be an increasingly important line just beyond the World Cup. And so we had this incredible sustained period of investment, of vision, leadership, and momentum, and then nothing. All progress stopped kind of during the Christie administration, both because of the recession that happened at the time and because the death of the ARC tunnel kind of really just tipped the system in a way that we kind of have not actually recovered from. But and investment improved a lot under Murphy, but we're dealing with decades of structural deficit, right? So we're playing catch up. And that's what we're seeing is structural deficit is for an agency, what it looks like, how the cost of being poor, how we talk about that for individuals in poverty. And so I just bring this up again to reemphasize the weight of state visioning and local action, because this shift in transit policy was largely driven by local decisions. If you notice, this was a lot of Bush era and Obama era. And actually, the Bush era is when we got, who was not particularly rail friendly, is when we got a lot of these projects started and going and kept them moving. And so even under the Obama administration, which was more friendly towards rail, we just didn't see that same type of a thing. And so point is, we have this in our muscle memory, we have this in our DNA, and this is in our control despite what's going on at the federal level. We actually have a very robust state capital program here. But one of the things that we need to do to get back to that golden age, and this is really important for NJTPA and the folks following in this room, is really acknowledging the inextricable relationship between land use and transportation. And again, land use decisions, these are in your control. These are locally made decisions, and they affect all of everything else that goes into it. The biggest factor in how people get around and how well they can get around actually has a lot more to do with land use and what we put where, development patterns, et cetera, than it does on the actual transportation assets itself. And so this is just like a quick sign, like you can think of Princeton Junction would be a good one to put into this model. Surrounded by giant surface parking lots. They're doing a bunch of development there now, but this was just a generic graphic we had put together for a recent report to show that. And so as this graphic shows, there are dramatically different emissions and resource intensities between the type of land use growth that, between sprawl, transit-oriented development. And so here what you have is our existing growth pattern. if we keep on trend and don't pay more attention to infill and transit-oriented development, and then what that could look like if we actually did make smart, thoughtful decisions about making our system more efficient for both businesses and people, right? The other thing that's worth mentioning here is that the TOD model is actually very good for taxpayers and for local budgets. In addition to the more, better environment, active lifestyle, this type of definition means that every dollar spent on infrastructure investment helps more constituents per square foot. So like every mile of pipe, pavement, or rail impacts a higher percentage of your residents. And that's just good finance, especially in a state that is almost paralyzed by our property tax discussions. So everyone likes demanding that there's transit, that transit should be more efficient and roads be less congested. And then we're making land use decisions at the local level that do not support any of these improvements. And we really need to be much more intentional about these relationships. And so, as you can see, the higher density also allows for more efficient land use, reducing per unit construction costs, and encourages communities of scale. And just to be clear about that TOD graphic, that's not like a bunch of Hobokens in the state. That is looking at the potential future for prioritizing infill and rehab with current densities without making everything look like Hoboken, because that's kind of the false dichotomy that gets brought up. So speaking of false dichotomies, I just wanted to kind of just re-emphasize here that smart growth is really context sensitive. This is just a range of built forms from single-family homes to mid-rise apartments and high-rise down there at the end. And just a reminder that density doesn't have to mean skyscrapers. Dense is relative. It can mean townhomes. We talk a lot about missing middle housing, small apartments over shops, accessory dwelling units. And this is all going to make our transportation system more efficient to maintain, and then also just for people to get around. And the good news is that this is already baked into a lot of our communities. And so this is from a recent Homes on Track report that this crowd might find really interesting. We did we analyzed transit-oriented development readiness at every heavy rail passenger stop in New York and downstate New York and New Jersey. And so the research found that about half of New Jersey residents already live within a 10-minute walk of transit. So we have this really good base. We're not starting from scratch. We just need to plan smart, remove some of our outdated barriers, and really keep going. And I can't focus on the word intentionally enough. And so that's where I'm going to leave it this morning. There are so many things that I really could have gone through here. We have Port Authority Bus Terminal is going to be one of the biggest, most important projects that constituents in North Jersey are going to feel immediately. I took that bus for a long time. I'm sorry if any of you here go into that terminal. It's rough. It is rough. And the vision that Port Authority has is fantastic, and it is going to be excellent. But again, we have to remember that when projects just have shovels in the ground, that's not time to forget about it and move on to the next thing. These really take stewardship. And again, especially, these are long-term investments. This growth is coming no matter what our kind of return to work from home scenarios look like. And so much of this is in local hands. And so I will leave it there. Oh, the other thing I did want to add is don't forget about the resources that NJTPA has for you also. And so they are one of New Jersey's best kept secrets in a lot of ways. And so when we're talking about vibrant downtowns and we're talking about some of the placemaking stuff that really helps get your station area or your downtown looking good, NJTPA can be there to help with that. So whether you're thinking about it, what can I get down in my downtown for a World Cup related celebration? What opportunities can we boost placemaking? How can we make ourselves more vibrant? And then how can we make sure that those are all pointing in towards the direction of our transportation investments so that we're really getting the most out of our placemaking and making our places as vibrant as possible? So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Zoe. Anybody have any questions from the board? Yes, sir. Commissioner Shaw?
So as you know, New Jersey's a home rule state.
Yeah.
And a couple regional plans that I'm very familiar with, obviously the state plan and the Highlands Regional Master Plan, they all in their formation called for designation of centers. And in most cases, those centers don't get designated because the local municipality doesn't want them. So how do you, it just seems like an impossible situation. I mean, how do you resolve that with the state being a home rule state and these, great regional planning concepts can't be implemented? The preservation side seems to get implemented, but the planning and growth side does not.
If I had a really good answer for that, I would not be standing in this room, right? However, I would share it with you though. But I think the non-flippant answer to that is we need to have better visioning for what we're talking about. I think it's very easy for plans to get ahead of a really well illustrated vision of what we're talking about. And so it becomes easy for folks in Bernardsville to say, oh, this transit-oriented development, this is gonna make it Hoboken. We're not Hoboken. And then everyone, kind of fluffs up the NIMBY crowd. And so I think one of the things I would say is getting designs out as early as possible is very, very helpful. Visually show people what you're doing. I think a lot of times we're responding, we're reacting, and we're just trying to get something out. But when there's a fear to bring people to the table, but if you start with a visual, it is very, very, very helpful. And so I think there's that. I think the other piece is honestly education, because at this point, everyone can say we need housing, but in someone else's town. You can read the van line study as much as you want, but neither of those address what is a very real need for governance. Governance is a verb. It's not a static thing that exists on paper. And we need to be working with our mayors and our planning departments and our people to understand that a lot of people have more than two children. They are increasing population. We're a great state to live in. We're going to keep attracting new people. And so we have to be very real about that. And so that's where I think having like a mixed version of density and an understanding of we designate growth centers because we want to direct growth into smart and sustainable places. It's not a perfect answer. I could poke holes in my own answer, but
That's what I would say, what is smart growth? Because I'm certainly not in favor of dumb growth, but it's hard to define smart growth.
well, dumb growth is when you put a warehouse out in the middle of nowhere and then allow the warehouse to say, NJ Transit needs to run a new bus line because I can't get workers to my warehouse. Or when you put it in the middle of a residential area and then your constituents are angry, right? And so how do we look at this? Bodies like NJTPA are excellent resources for that regional planning, for those conversations. Remember years ago, it was the big issue of the big box stores. Everyone put the big box store right on the border of town, so all the traffic would go there and they'd get the ratables, right? We have to stop that. And I think conversations like this are the only way to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Shaw. Anybody else from the board?
Yes.
Oh, go ahead, Jay.
So you spoke quite a bit about transit-oriented development, and you talked about the importance of replacing the Port Authority bus terminal. It seems like the conversations in New Jersey around TOD tend to center around the rail station. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about TOD that's a little more focused or oriented toward the bus network.
So that gets a little more complicated. It was interesting because, I say this with love for NJ Transit. A huge part of my job is helping make sure NJ Transit is a well-funded, excellent organization. But because of the structural deficits, they have trouble with data. And that's just a fact of an underfunded agency. And so when the Aspire regulations came out, they actually did cite like high-frequency bus stops should be eligible for this type of benefit. And there's this whole behind-the-scenes back and forth about, well, give us a list of the high-frequency bus stops in the transit network, and we don't have them because bus A changes a little bit more frequently. Rail is called fixed rail for a reason. And bus stop isn't a bus stop isn't a bus stop, right? So you have a few hubs where you could really do this. We actually are creating a methodology right now for this exact TOD study on the bus side. We're piloting it in Connecticut and hope to bring that to New Jersey as well. The original part was just funding rail studies, which is traditional and easier. So happy to share that with this crowd then. But we do need to be looking at bus, but we need to make sure it's meaningful bus hubs with decent headways. Otherwise, again, we're going to call it transit-oriented development. There's going to be one bus line that you're going to need 3 connections to get anywhere useful. And so I think it's a little bit of making sure that we're thinking about the nerdier, less sexy parts of transit, like data collection, and then also thinking about really prioritizing and naming those places.
Thank you. Anybody else? Oh, right ahead.
Hi, Zoe. It's, I think as you astutely pointed, regional transportation doesn't stop at the Hudson River. It's not 1910, right? So yet a lot of our funding systems, agencies, mechanisms do. They don't cross the river. So has RPA or any others really taken on that conversation of how do we look at sort of regional funding to fund the kind of transit that we need?
We have, and we really, really wanted to do some sort of a pilot with the World Cup, but part of this is not New Jersey's fault. We got notice of our winning of the World Cup designation like a little late in the game, but that is something that we absolutely need to be looking for. That was part of the problem of the implementation with congestion pricing. Everywhere else in the world has been implemented. All of these systems are more integrated. And so, especially when we think about having World Cup or other world events like this, we're going to need to make the system easier to use. I personally was frustrated when PATH went with not Omni because now I have two different systems, just for those alone. And so RPA has been looking at cross compatibility. We need to be looking at this in a much more robust and meaningful way. But again, what we do is look at the long-term pieces and eventually shepherd our agencies there. I think without more people calling for it, it's going to be harder to do.
Anyone else? Anybody from the public? All right, Zoe, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.